Gus. Hey, Shayne.
Hey,
It's nice to have you here with us.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. So for everyone who's tuning in, hi, my name is Marilyn Zakhour. I'm the founder and CEO of Cosmic Centaurs, and I'm really happy to be welcoming you to our fourth session of the Future of Teams conference. This is, of course, our second annual edition of the Cosmic Conference, and we're exploring team dynamics in distributed settings. And we are going to be here on LinkedIn and Facebook Live for this panel, but also two more panels this afternoon, actually a panel and a closing debate, if I'm being precise, which will be starting at 4 p.m. Dubai time. And as Talat just mentioned, we're going to have two workshops tomorrow, one with Shayne, who's right here on team rituals, and one in the morning on team identity. Now let's get the game started. You know, I told Gus and Shayne that this would be the panel I'm most looking forward to, and they both told me I was saying this to everybody. And so I committed to saying this live right here in front of all of you so that they would believe me. Because as you might know, I'm an architect by training. And so even though I've done a million other things since studying architecture, I'm still very passionate about the impact of both the physical and virtual space on humans, and particularly in the context of today's conversation on how they collaborate and how they work together and try to create magic. And by way of a quick introduction, before I introduce Gus and Shayne officially, you know, last year we asked one of our panels, is the office dead? You know, and at that time, that was a question that was kind of worth asking, because it was not so much because we thought the office would be dead. It's not like all of this commercial real estate is going to disappear, you know, but rather because we were wondering, and I'm still wondering, if it's time for the office to be reborn. Gus writes a lot about the history of the office. One of the, you know, origin of the name from Latin actually does not mean place. It means the performance of a task. It's those two words, opus and facere, to work and to do. And originally, you guys might know this from English, holding office wasn't about having a space. It was about the work that you perform. And the way that our offices are designed today are really inherited from the Industrial Revolution. They still pretty much look the same. And the internet could have been an opportunity to rethink them, but maybe it didn't catalyze, you know, sufficiently drastic changes, but COVID did, right? You know the joke. Who accelerated digital transformation in your company? Is it the CMO, the CEO, the CTO? No, it's COVID. Shayne, I see you reacting to that. So I brought in two people that I think are going to make this conversation about what should our workspaces be like, especially in an omni-channel environment, to come and chat with me on this. Gus, Dr. Augustin Chevez. He's an honorary fellow of management and marketing at the University of Melbourne since 2019. He is an architect and an academic, and he's dedicated his career to discovering the notion of work and uncovering environments that best support our working lives. His work has been presented at various international forums and published in both academic and industry publications. And Shayne Smart, now that's a name, is a highly versatile change consultant with over 5,000 hours experience in workshop design, facilitation, and delivery. And he has over 10 years of experience in designing effective co-creation workshops and facilitation of engaging audiences internally and externally. He has a proven multinational capability to engage teams, establish alignment to vision, and get their goals faster. Hi, guys. How are you guys doing? Are you ready for the most interesting conversation of the week?
Yeah, architecture and remote. What could be more exciting?
I know, right? I mean, at least it's really exciting to me. So I'm going to ask you the same question we asked, you know, our panelists last year. Gus, I'll start with you. Is the office dead?
I really like that question, but I think it's a bit loaded in the sense it has so much in it. And rightly so, because work and where we work it's very emotional, and it's something that affects us quite directly. One thing that I like to remind people is that the office is an invention. Now, this sounds silly, but if we think about work as a phenomenon, and then we do a timeline, the office has hosted work for such a small fraction of time that having this question, that we're dead or not, it talks about more of our assumptions of how we should be working rather than this continuum. And fun fact, before there were offices as we know them now, we used to work at home. For many reasons that we don't have time to go here, businesses got too big and people needed to work outside from home and outside from the family and start working in other places. And this created that the culture and the behaviors that were enacted at home were not longer enacted at that other place, which later became the office. So that is why it's now so difficult to reconcile, trying to put the cat back in the bag, as they say, or because these cultures and behaviors have evolved so differently that it's hard to bring it back. And now it's very hard to reconcile these two domains between work and life. But yeah, so to answer more directly your question, I don't think the office is going to die. I think it's evolving to the workplace, where we work. It evolves continuously, and hopefully the office as we know it start to give way to new environments that are better equipped to host the work in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Shayne, I see you want to react to that.
Yeah, I think it's a really, I mean, thanks for going into the history of it. Out of all that massive amount of knowledge that I just picked up, the one thing that I really felt is that you see often is that it sounds like we just kind of started doing it and we didn't sit down and design the experience. And I think that's usually what results in the worst experiences over the long term. You know, we used to work in factories, or we work in offices which are built like factories, and nobody thought, oh, we don't do that same work anymore. Why don't we redesign the experience? So thank you, office work co-worker COVID, for sorting that out. Is the office dead? I think some offices are dead, and I think the best sign of it, if your office is dead, is if you see a lot of people who look like zombies walking around. It's probably time to probably died. You should get out there and run.
That's a really good point. And I think, yeah, it is absolutely an opportunity for redesigning. You know, something that I really love from my days as an architect, at least in French. I don't know if it translates exactly to English, but when you start to design a building, you, at least in school, because I never actually built anything, you know, I just got a degree in being an architect, you get a sheet and it has on it what's going to go into the building. And in French, it's called a program. I don't know if it's the same thing in English, Gus. Maybe you can confirm or deny that. But what I really find interesting about this idea that there's a program is that it's also, you could associate it with different things. In French, software is also called un programme. And so there's so many different kind of links in the language between the program meaning the experience of a theater or a play, the program meaning software. And all of these things come, to your point, Shayne, with a lot of intentionality about what it is that we come here to perform together. And I'm sure there was intentionality in the, you know, let's say in the industrial design of an office, the intentionality was supervision, right? Originally, you had the manager sitting here and then all the other people sitting on the other end, and they could supervise their work much like they do in a factory. But perhaps by copying designs over and over again, we might have lost the meaning and the why they exist.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about how many jobs exist today that just didn't exist 10 years ago or 20 years ago, that's definitely going to be the case. But I'm interested to hear what Gus thinks about the evolution of work against the change in office design.
Absolutely. And I think we're starting to realize that work is much more than the outputs. And it also gives, nurtures sense of purpose, belonging, and identity. And the notion of work that you describe, which is a production line, focuses predominantly in the outputs, what is being produced. But when we move more into a knowledge worker, which the output is not a thing that can be quantified in such a way and use the same terms of productivity that are a legacy of the conveyor belt, that's when the environment needs to change, because a lot of what we're seeing right now is work has been deconstructed in its tasks, and the tasks have been very successfully automated. And that's why tasks are very portable. I can write an email, I can do spreadsheet or PowerPoint or Microsoft Word, I can do those tasks pretty much everywhere and anywhere. But work requires a specific cues and an environment that nurtures those very important aspects that we need to differentiate between work and tasks. So, and that's why I agree with Shayne as well. He was saying sometimes you can tell if the office is dying by the look in the employees, but also it's not all about how poorly the office was designed, but how bad work is designed. I always say, let's design work first, then the workplace. Because if you don't have a purposeful, meaningful work, no workplace will suffice.
There's also nothing like a 2-hour commute to come in and check your email and chat with your colleagues across a few desks across. That's, you know, and enter some data into a computer system. I think we shouldn't also forget that if you look back 20 years ago, some of the offices that people are working in, the level of portability that you have now with computing, just in terms of even battery power changes, is huge. I mean, Steve Jobs wasn't sliding laptops out of inter-office envelopes 20 years ago. That's really, 10 years now, right?
Yeah, and I think you both make a really beautiful point about the importance of what is it that you design first. Gus, you said it very beautifully. We should be designing work before we design spaces. Maybe that brings me, Shayne, to the virtual side of the design, right? Which is, of course, you are, I'll say it, a real visionary when it comes to designing virtual collaboration spaces. I've been in some of the spaces that you design, and I know a lot of your work comes from inspiration, also comes from gaming. We'll come to that in a minute, but tell us about your process for how you think about designing the experience and designing the outcome first, and then designing those virtual spaces that lead to that outcome for teams that use the murals and Miros that you create.
Yeah, it's a great lead-in from what Gus was just saying. So it's always first about what is the work that needs to be achieved, and then who needs to achieve it, and then the rest is really about building environments which help them understand how to interact or collaborate. So if you take the objective is to maintain and share ideas, for example, and then they choose the metaphor to be a garden, usually chosen by the users. It doesn't usually work for me to dictate what environment they want to work in, because at the end of the day, it's the environment they want to work in, not the environment I want them to work in. And I think that's part of the enjoyment of the challenge, is find out what it is they want, and then try and take all these things that just don't fit together, but make it work within the work process. So in terms of after looking at what is it they need to achieve and what is the process, then it's about designing the methods that are going to work for them. So we're all familiar with now hundreds and hundreds of different workshop exercises and patterns. So it's about how to take those together and overlay them within the metaphor. So we had one recently which was a garden, and the idea was having projects, and therefore, how could you share status? Well, you can look at the height of the tree, the growth of the tree, the activity of planting the tree. All those kind of things provide a direct metaphor connection. But what's really interesting, I think, in the scope of building those places is to think about where is it sited? Because when I think about the place I want to work, I really love to work on the top of a hill, looking over the sea, with my friends very close, and my colleagues just around the corner to talk to for the things that I need to learn. And most of the time, I'm either looking at the sea, having great ideas, or I'm listening to the sea and focusing and working. So in order to cite any virtual space, it's not only about where explicitly it is, but it's imagining what is behind it. What are the ambient sounds that you might bring in, for example, into that space? Or after I have sat in this virtual space for 3 months or 6 months, what happens if I go and look over that horizon? Because the second you can make that a horizon, then I can think about being in a larger world and more connected with other people virtually.
Yeah, I think definitely that's a really beautiful point around how you can choose who and what is in it, but also what is beyond it, and all of these experiences that you can curate in the virtual world. I always used to say that I went from studying architecture and creating, with the intent of creating spaces in the physical world, to actually creating them in the virtual world. Even a website is a virtual space. And something that's interesting, conceptually, with what the pandemic did, and Gus, I'd love to ask you a really tough question there, is that it separated, for me, it separated workspace, like, square meters, so to speak, or virtual square meters, from work time, because now it's not like a condensed block of time, but also workplace, which is all the implicit things about the place where you are. We'll certainly talk about that with Joe later today. I know that's a concept very close to his heart, but we are not working in a incognito unit of space or time. We're working in a physical location. It has history, it has meaning. Those things are very difficult to dissociate from work, right? Gus, you mentioned that earlier about identity and how you connect to the organization. And I think the question that I have, which is a very difficult one, is everything we've said so far is about making things explicit, making the work design explicit, the goal, the outcome explicit, and then designing for them. Gus, how do you think about tacit knowledge and implicit knowledge in workspace design?
Yes, I think one of the biggest arguments of having people co-located is to use the space as a knowledge transfer tool. That was one of the questions that we posed a few years ago. We were Googling knowledge management systems, and everything was a tool, like an IT tool. So the question we have is, can we use space as a knowledge transfer tool? Especially for the tacit one, the one that you cannot codify, because there's knowledge that you can put into codify, travels very well, information. That's where email and all the different devices, our platforms are very successful. But how do you transfer culture and all the things of how things are done that are so difficult to write or to put somewhere? And for that is that the workplace has a very important role. There's this concept in Japanese architecture called ba, which is used as a platform of using space as a knowledge transfer. And what we found there is a key for transferring knowledge as well was trust. So you will not communicate or share knowledge with someone that you don't trust. Think about this. Knowledge is a commodity that its value resides in the competition does not knowing what I know. So if you don't trust, you won't share. Long story short, one of the most successful spaces that we found to transfer knowledge and to develop trust were back then the stairwells of offices where people will go out and smoke, because what happened there is that will flatten the organization. So people will go there, the CEO and the junior will go there, have a smoke, and they will get to know each other, talk about things that were not related to work, but develop that level of trust. And then things will happen and they will share more knowledge. So how do you find that space with a more positive connotation and open to people that might not smoke more widely, that you can create that bond, that very strong bond by using space?
It's very bad as a consultant for your health to give up smoking.
I love that. I think that's really very interesting to focus not on the tacit knowledge, because that's a problem we can't solve. It's tacit for a reason, like the word locks us in, but rather on how do we use space design to create trust. Actually, and that's a really beautiful example on the physical world, but that brings me to a question I wanted to ask both of you, kind of inspired by video games. Gus, you've done research into video games like Second Life, and Shayne, I mean, you're an avid gamer. You have an alter ego called Serenity Steel, which is a really cool name. You launched an in-game IPO, you were elected, vice chairman, you formed a constitutional democracy, like all sorts of crazy things. I don't know when you have time for any of this, but on that topic, what do you think? Maybe we can start with you, Shayne, but what do you think we can learn from gaming environments that we need to bring back in virtual and physical collaboration spaces or workspaces?
Wow. Well, I'll try not to talk too long, Gus, because I know you also want to talk about this one. I think the question is more like, what can't we bring back from gaming environments? Because gaming environments, or at least the games that I played, what you call hardcore gaming, which means more than 12 hours a day for several years, is really about how do you get a group of 150 or 1,000 people to collaborate 24 hours a day on a project for which they're not paid, yet find particularly interesting and are willing to dedicate and get up strange hours of the day for. And almost all of that is about having a purpose, a shared purpose, but it's also about working to interest rather than priority. So people are passionate about, if you take it in a company context, and I took the management style that I developed there and I've applied it at least 2 times with large teams to see if it'll work. And when you take people based on what their core interest is or the particular competence they want to develop and organize around that, then you immediately have an opportunity to engage all your workers. So I'd say take all the aspects of gamification.
Wow, that's really beautiful point. And that's very interesting. You know, a lot of, I've been listening to a few podcasts this week with, investors and talking a lot about what makes startup teams successful and so on. And a point you make that I heard a couple of times, so I'm just going to resonate that for you, is that in the early days, you don't hire the team to accomplish the goal of the company. It's rather that the company gets built around those who join. And that's why it's so important to make sure that the early members are going to build a vision together, because in fact, they have such huge impact on the outcome of what the company does. It's precisely because it's built around what they really want to do, as opposed to them getting a reward or a really big bonus at the end of the year. So that's a really interesting, parallel over there.
Building. I mean, in all those really large organizations we had in the games, it was always, what is the purpose? Clear definition, like the constitutional democracy was, well, we're 10 people. We've written this thing called the Constitution. Anybody like it? You want to come join? If you like it, you can just sign up. Come on in. 1,500 people later,
Damn, that's crazy. Gus, what about you? What does your research into the virtual world tell us?
I'm really bad at games, but my interest in especially Second Life was to understand the Skeuomorphism of work. And that's a mouthful, but skeuomorphism is to try to understand the cues or the characteristics that one object have, and how you can transplant those in another object that is not the original one to communicate the same cues. So back in the day, it was 2008, I went all the way to Manchester, which there was a very interesting organization that designed their office in Second Life. So I wanted to see what are the cues that they perceived they needed to represent in this virtual environment, especially because their office was amazing. It was this fantastic sphere made out of glass, floating in the middle of the sea. Complete disregard of physics. Who want to be burdened by the laws of physics when you can create something like that? But the skeuomorphism of work was literal. So we are more willing to create a world in which a crystal sphere can float in the middle of sea and have all these employees, but not realize that if our avatars are not looking to each other, we're not collaborating. They're fantastic screenshots in which these avatars are these phenomenal creatures, as you can imagine, but when they're talking to each other, they're talking eye to eye. Now, if you are a creature, a mythological creature, talking to another person over the internet in a floating crystal ball on the sea, why do you need to look at each other to convey that sense? So that is what I'm interested in. What types of cues do we need to put in virtual environments, but then as a feedback process, what do we need to retain in the real world?
Wow, that's really incredible. Actually, I have a big question from Tala, our Tala, that I think is well placed in comparison to what you just said, about what cues you retain and how you transfer them over from physical to virtual or virtual to virtual. Like, doesn't really matter. But she asks, when you were talking to us about these trust zones, she's curious about the virtual equivalent. Shayne, maybe you can speak to that. But how do you create inclusive workspaces in a virtual space where it's a safe space versus the rest of the environment?
Yeah, so it's difficult for me to answer just how do you create the inclusive spaces, because often people think about how do you include people who are in minority groups or in diverse groups, of which I sit in one. So in my mind, it's how do you create an environment which flourishes and works for everybody in a way that is that everybody succeeds. And I think for me, the answer to that is always transparency. I think I've not observed yet, I may be wrong, but I've not observed yet where any group that was opaque, where you couldn't see into what was happening, where things weren't reported, where there were locked rooms, hidden agendas. Literally, we have in Outlook now, people hide their agendas. Do they have a hidden agenda? Well, probably. So anywhere that you can bring transparency, then that usually makes a safe place, with the exception that if you bring transparency, then people are biased towards you. So there's this kind of, I can be transparent, but perhaps I still want to be a dragon.
Look, that's very interesting. I think we could make this debate about that. And by the way, just a couple of notes from the audience. Haima says he could listen to this panel forever. And honestly, I could be in this conversation forever. Yulia also agrees. And I just want to say that's a really interesting cultural concept for me. And I think Esther Perel, I don't know if you know her, she's a psychologist. She puts it very beautifully on this topic of transparency versus trust. And she says that trust is actually the opposite in that sense of transparency. And I think it's cultural, really, because if you trust me, then you don't need me to be transparent with you, because you trust that I will always have the correct intent and try to take the right action. You don't need me to give you full transparency, for example, into my agenda, for you to trust me. And that's a really interesting one, too. I definitely also agree with you, Shayne, that the opposite, the fact of being opaque, which is not the same thing as not having full transparency, that's definitely not a promoter of trust.
I wonder what you think about that. Difference between the two. It's like, I have an office space and I leave my door open when I'm not there. Anybody can go and look at my calendar, and sometimes they need to, so they do.
Yeah.
Is different from the second I walk out the door, I lock it. And in fact, if you come into the door, I hide my books and you can't see my calendar. Or my hidden agenda, or who I've just been speaking to, or any other information. So it's one thing to broadcast it and make it always available, but it's another to provide the availability. I'm not withholding it from you. And particularly in remote, I've seen some pretty horrible versions of exclusion occur because of hidden agendas, because you can't see people walking down the corridor together and having that meeting. From an exclusion perspective, you can't see who's left outside the room as a team meets.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's a really, really good point. There's a lot of questions, but I'm going to pick one from Lemma. She says, in the new hybrid reality, what would a redesigned space work, which can maintain and boost collaboration, look like? Gus, maybe you want to start with this one. If you were to redesign the workspace, what is something you would change in it?
Well, go back to the first principle and redesign work first. And one of the things we have is this obsession with collaboration. And why do we need to collaborate for? Collaboration has been one of those pendulum effects that we went through. Yes, let's collaborate as much as we can. And now we start moderating that. Collaboration has a cost. And can create problems in the culture. There's this term that some researchers coined. It's called corporate citizenship, in which it's a bureaucratic burden in which it creates this notion that everybody needs to contribute or collaborate or put their 5 cents into it, and that really slows things down. So, and there's another book more mainstream called Quiet, in which says that 50% of the population are introverts, and much of the work as how we design work, not the workplace, but how we design work, favors the extrovert, the one that can better articulate his or her idea and communicate it at the expense of the person that is quiet on the corner. So should all the decisions be based on who is more vocal in a meeting room, or should we create this type of environment? So to answer the question, we can go through whether open plan promotes collaboration or not, or whether it's a fascinating insight that actually the more recent thinking, and even though these thinkings go back from the 80s, but has been tested now, is that the psychological safety that enclosed environments give you more allowance to interact more. So there's some studies that suggest that people in enclosed offices actually collaborate more than those that in open offices. But that's another way. So it's a very complex question. But the best answers will be, well, what is it how do you want to work? And then we design the workplace.
And perhaps how do you want to work at different times of the day or for different activities?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really excellent point, Gus. And definitely that's one of the data points we had for you guys, of course, is that in open workspaces, face-to-face interaction actually decreased by 70%, which sounds really common sense. You're like, but you're in front of everybody. And I'm like, yes, but I don't want to look at anybody else. And that brings a really interesting point about making sure that we measure what we want to create, right? And that we're not just using these open workspaces because in effect, they're actually a lot cheaper to have, right? And hopefully now that the cheap solution is work from somewhere else, maybe we can see open spaces disappear from our plans. But Shayne, you also resonated, I think, with this thing about introverts and extroverts, and that's just one kind of data point of diversity. And you did speak earlier towards creating those spaces that are inclusive of all, right? Something that I've been really thinking about in terms of including others, partly because Mark, who was our keynote speaker, writes a lot about it, but also because I recently listened to a really amazing podcast episode in the Knowledge Project about it, is loneliness. And loneliness isn't a pandemic problem. It's been around, and there's plenty of data to show that we have a loneliness epidemic. It has a really high cost. We know that people who are lonelier tend to die earlier, and there are certain forms of diseases that they tend to develop more often, and not to mention the kind of mental well-being piece. I wonder, how do you design spaces, particularly virtual ones, Shayne, in that sense, that can help to combat that? You did mention wanting to work on a hill overlooking the sea with your community and friends and family around you. What are your thoughts around how we deal with loneliness in the virtual space?
Yeah, so from the workshop perspective, of course, you've seen the rise of check-ins and check-outs, and that I think has helped in the ritual of the moment. But for virtual spaces, perhaps I'm exceptional because I think spatially. So when I want to arrive at the virtual office, then I want to be virtually in a location where I have a presence and I can see others and I can interact with them spontaneously. But also, if I think about there's this great opportunity to do so much deep work. If you can turn off your Slack notifications and your phone notifications, and you can get into deep work. And the joy of deep work is, if you're more productive, then why not spend those times connecting with other people through shared experience? And of course, the best shared experience is a game. But whether or not you're playing just simple games with your colleagues, there are also many different ways to explore together in play. And play is a moment in which you are both experimenting, and also when you achieve things together with your colleagues, it creates a bond together.
Yeah, let me rephrase that. I think that's a really interesting thought, which is that if we're able to create to use this distance from each other to create more time for deep work, which technically would allow me to get things done faster, I'm freeing up a whole other block of time that instead of me being averagely productive and connected over a period, now I'm kind of separating those two things from each other. And maybe instead of working during this time, we can play. And you're reminding me of, we have team time in our, that's one of our rituals. So we have every 3 weeks, an hour dedicated to doing anything except working together. And we kind of occupy it with different things. Sometimes we do coaching, etc. And one of our most memorable ones was actually we played online Pictionary and discovered that Tala is incredibly competitive at Pictionary, and takes it very seriously. But it's definitely a moment that's really ingrained in my mind. And I truly wanted to rephrase your point to make sure I remember it, Gus, I have a question around that too. In that podcast, I was listening to the person who was speaking there. She was talking about hostile architecture, right? Like we know that in city designs and also building designs, there are a lot of things that we do to keep people away, like benches that slip so people don't spend too much time on them, or things that are difficult to sleep on so the homeless people don't linger. I wonder if we could be on the positive side of this. We read that Jacinda Ardern has allocated a well-being budget as part of her economic KPIs, again, around this topic of bringing people together and removing that aspect of loneliness that's really creeped in with the pandemic. I wonder if you could talk to me, are there any beautiful examples of physical places that bring people together and that create space for community and connection?
Yes, and that's a topic that fascinates me because the concept of aloneness and together.
Gus is having some connection problems, I believe. That's perfectly all right. We're going to talk about the next question. And actually, I think there's a question in the audience that we can take in the meantime. I think this one's for you, Shayne, since you brought up the concept of transparency. May asks, how can we start the conversation around transparency via workspace setup and behavior without standing out as a troublemaker? Now, I'm pretty sure you've always been... Hi, guys. We'll come back to you. Coming back. Shayne, you've always been a troublemaker, I'm sure, but what advice do you have around having a conversation about transparency?
I mean, that conversation is different the world over. Absolutely different the world over. But it's often very good to make that metaphor between, particularly in remote work, just make a metaphor between real life. Hey, every time I come into your office, the door's shut. Or why is it that you all kind of sneak in through the back door of the office so nobody can see you? Where did you all come from? 20 of you just walked out through that door, but we didn't see you go in. It's like all these you could almost role play, imagine the craziness of seeing it. But I think that the main opportunity is by providing, it's to open the conversation of what is the goal that you want to achieve. If the goal you want to achieve is see who's being included and excluded, then what mechanisms are we willing to do that? Are we willing to open our diaries up? Are we willing to create a visualization? Do we show ourselves on a simple digital whiteboard where we are during the day so that we can see who's meeting with who?
Yeah, that's another good one. I think we discussed this a little bit, you and I, in one of our past conversations. There's this whole wave of virtual HQs that are being designed that are a bit like, a bit 2D environments, like Mario in the 90s. So everything's a bit pixelated, but people actually have desks and you can see where they are and who they're talking to at the moment. I always say it's like the Marauder's map, in Harry Potter, where you can see where everybody is. What are your thoughts around these kind of like virtual HQ concepts?
I think if the intent is, because again, you have to think about the objective of the visualization, but if the objective is to understand who is available to quickly tap for example, tacit knowledge, then they're great. I think they will evolve. I think they will evolve into places, I guess. I think they'll evolve into places that are visually attractive. And we use the affordances of the office today because that's the most recent thing. But when the affordance is the home, perhaps, then the virtual office design could be totally different. Welcome back, Gus.
Hi, sorry I dropped off my internet connection.
It happens. This is the
In
beauty
one of the most passionate questions that I'm loneliness, aloneness, and togetherness fascinates me, and I have gone through big extents to experience that. We don't have time to go through there, but very quickly, loneliness can be experienced by being alone or in a group. And this is very important because we tend to think that just putting together people in a group will take care of that. So the fact of being alone can be manifested as solitude, which is the creative one that we want to explore, and can be manifested in loneliness, which is the negative one. So we want to make sure that when we're alone by ourselves, we experience solitude and not the other. But we can experience solitude in a crowd. And this is very important, especially for office design, because if you create, again, a very bossing environment in which that person does not belong to that cohort or is not really identifiable with them, they will feel alone, loneliness in a sea of people. Yeah. So it's a very interesting construct that needs to be moderated, and also to understand that when we talk about socialization or putting people together, it's not only about increasing collaboration. I think it's Norway or one of those Scandinavian countries that makes it illegal to have a guinea pig, just one. You need to have two. Because they're very social creatures and they die. So when we recognize that for other animals, other species, why not with humans, and understand that they need to be together? It's not because it's not like these guinea pigs are collaborating for the next unicorn or whatever business they're putting together. No, they need to be together. It's important. Some of the research that I have done in co-working highlight the importance of being together alone. I just want to be among other people working on my own thing.
The cafe with the laptop.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that. After a while, I'm like, I can't be sitting in this office anymore. I get to take my stuff and go somewhere. So I experienced that at a very, very personal level. Guys, like Ahmad said, I could be in this panel forever. And in fact, I'm thinking we should do number 2, maybe in a couple of weeks. But I have to now wrap it up and take you to our rapid fire questions, because I also really want to hear your answer to those. And so, Shayne, we'll start with you and then you, Gus. Shayne, what's the skill that every leader needs to have today that may have been less important in the past?
Designing experiences, experience design.
That's a very good one. What about you, Gus? What do you think?
Just recognizing a new one, perhaps this ability to be enact leadership in a hybrid mode. So again, space supports leadership in one way, which is not the same as in digital leadership. So leadership in hybrid ways.
That's a very good answer too, yeah. Shayne, what's the one book every leader needs to read?
I'm going to give a biased answer. The Cycles Innovation.
Is it your own?
Comes out shortly. I may have contributed to it.
I love that. Can you repeat the name and we'll put it in our comments?
The Cycles.
Done deal. Gus, how about you? What's the book every leader should read?
I will say Think Again by Adam Grant, because it invites us to rethink how we form our beliefs. And I think it's a very important way of always checking on how we believe the things that we believe, especially if you're leading others.
That's a really good one too, I agree. Shayne, what is the perfect song to work to?
Oh, definitely Yotto, Hyperfall.
Right. Love it. Gus, what about you?
More than a song is style, jazz. I love jazz. The problem with that is I love it so much that then I stop working and just listen to it.
It's not very useful, Gus. Shayne, what is the perfect team size?
I would say a pod of 3 for performance and 4 for a bit of resilience.
That's an interesting answer. Gus, what about you?
I'll say 11 if you're playing soccer and 5 if you're playing basketball, because it really depends what is it that you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a bit of a trick question, this one, we know. And then last question to you, Shayne, is the future of teams is, complete that sentence with a word.
Support to autonomously reach their goals, or autonomous achievement.
That's a good mouthful. We're going to have to unpack that later. Gus, what about you?
I think it's exciting. And that's a...
Oh, on this exciting note, Gus's internet has dropped again, but that's okay, right on time, because he did give us his word.
Great smiling freeze frame.
I know, he looks good. We should take the portrait picture right now. Listen, I mean, I really, truly enjoyed this. I thought this was so inspiring, and I have so many concepts I need to unpack in my head later today. Thank you so much, Shayne. Thanks, Gus. I hope you'll rewatch this or come back maybe in a few seconds, and I can thank you in person. And really, like, such an insightful conversation. And I could see from the comments in the that you'll see later, maybe Shayne, on LinkedIn and Facebook Live, people were really very much inspired by this conversation. So I'm very grateful for everything you brought to it.
Sorry,
and of course,
my internet's been playing up. Sorry.
It's okay. Stick around so I can wrap up. And a huge thank you, of course, to our listeners for tuning in. Do add questions if you want. You know, Shayne and Gus could come back later, thanks to the beautiful powers of the internet, and answer you in the comments. Gus, Shayne, thanks so much for joining me today. This was really such an incredible conversation, and I look forward to more great conversations with the two of you. Ciao.